Welcome back to Classic Stories and Fairy Tales. I am your host and narrator, Jerry Coble, and today we will be wrapping up the book titled Cranford by Elizabeth C. Gaskell with the final two chapters. So let's get started with chapter 15, titled A Happy Return. Before I left Miss Matty at Cranford, everything had been comfortably arranged for her. Even Miss Jamieson's approval of her selling tea had been gained. That oracle had taken a few days to consider whether by so doing Miss Matty would forfeit her right to the privileges of society in Cranford. I think she had some little idea of mortifying Lady Glenmire by the decision she gave at last, which was to this effect, that whereas a married woman takes her husband's rank by the strict laws of precedence, an unmarried woman retains the station her father occupied. So Cranford was allowed to visit Miss Matty, and whether allowed or not, it intended to visit Lady Glenmire. But what was our surprise, our dismay, when we learnt that Mr. and Miss Hoggins were returning on the following Tuesday. Miss Hoggins! Had she absolutely dropped her title, and so, in a spirit of bravado, cut their aristocracy to become a Hoggins? She who might have been called Lady Glenmire to her dying day? Miss Jamieson was pleased. She said it only convinced her of what she had known from the first, that the creature had a low taste. But the creature looked very happy on Sunday at church, nor did we see it necessary to keep our veils down on that side of our bonnets on which Mr. and Miss Hoggins sat, as Miss Jamieson did, thereby missing all the smiling glory of his face and all the becoming blushes of hers. I am not sure if Martha and Jem looked more radiant in the afternoon when they, too, made their first appearance. Miss Jamieson soothed the turbulence of her soul by having the blinds of her windows drawn down, as if for a funeral, on the day when Mr. and Miss Hoggins received callers, and it was with some difficulty that she was prevailed upon to continue the St. James Chronicle, so indignant was she with its having inserted the announcement of the marriage. Miss Matty's sale went off famously. She retained the furniture of her sitting room and bedroom, the former of which she was to occupy till Martha could meet with a lodger who might wish to take it, and into this sitting room and bedroom she had to cram all sorts of things, which were, the auctioneer assured her, bought in for her at the sale by an unknown friend. I always suspected Miss Fitzadams of this, but she must have had an accessory. Who knew what articles were particularly regarded by Miss Matty on account of their associations with her early days? The rest of the house looked rather bare, to be sure, all except one tiny bedroom, of which my father allowed me to purchase the furniture for my occasional use in case of Miss Matty's illness. I had expanded my own small store in buying all manners of comfits and lozenges, in order to tempt the little people who Miss Matty loved so much to come about her. Tea in bright green canisters, and comfits in tumblers. Miss Matty and I felt quite proud as we looked round us on the evening before the shop was to be opened. Martha had scoured the boarded floor to a white cleanness, and it was adorned with a brilliant piece of oilcloth, on which customers were to stand before the table counter. The wholesome smell of plaster and whitewash pervaded the apartment. A very small Matilda Jenkins, licensed to sell tea, was hidden under the lintel of the new door, and 2 boxes of tea, with cabalistic inscriptions all over them, stood ready to disgorge their contents into the canisters. Miss Matty, as I ought to have mentioned before, had had some scruples of conscience at selling tea when there was already Mr. Johnson in the town, who included it among his numerous commodities. And before she could quite reconcile herself to the adoption of her new business, she had trotted down to his shop, unknown to me, to tell him of the project that was entertained, and to inquire if it was likely to injure his business. My father called this idea of hers great nonsense, and wondered how tradespeople were to get on if there was to be a continual consulting of each other's interest, which would put a stop to all competition directly. And perhaps it would not have done in Drumble, but in Cranford it answered very well, for not only did Mr. Johnson kindly put at rest all Miss Matty's scruples and fear of injuring his business, but I have reason to know he repeatedly sent customers to her, saying that the teas he kept were a common kind, but that Miss Jenkins had all the choice sorts, and expensive tea is a very favorite luxury with well-to-do tradespeople and rich farmers' wives, who turn up their noses at the conguao and souchong prevalent at many tables of gentility, and will have nothing else than gunpowder and pekoe for themselves. But to return to Miss Matty, it was really very pleasant to see how her unselfishness and simple sense of justice called out the same good qualities in others. She never seemed to think anyone would impose upon her, because she should be so grieved to do it to them. I have heard her put a stop to the asseverations of the man who brought her coals by quietly saying, "I am sure you would be sorry to bring me wrong weight." And if the coals were short measure that time, I don't believe they were ever again. People would have felt as much ashamed of presuming on her good faith as they would have done on that of a child. But my father says such simplicity might be very well in Cranford, but would never do in the world. And I fancy the world must be very bad. For with all my father's suspicion of everyone with whom he has dealings, and in spite of all his many precautions, he lost upwards of £1,000 by roguery only last year. I just stayed long enough to establish Miss Matty in her new mode of life, and to pack up the library which the rector had purchased. He had written a very kind letter to Miss Matty, saying how glad he should be to take a library so well selected as he knew that the late Mr. Jenkins must have been at any valuation put upon them. And when she agreed to this, with a touch of sorrowful gladness that they would go back to the rectory and be arranged on the accustomed walls once more, he sent word that he feared that he had not room for them all, and perhaps Miss Matty would kindly allow him to leave some volumes on her shelves. But Miss Matty said that she had her Bible and Johnson's dictionary, and should not have much time for reading, she was afraid. Still, I retained a few books out of consideration for the rector's kindness. The money which he had paid, and that produced by the sale, was partly expended in the stock of tea, and part of it was invested against a rainy day, old age or illness. It was but a small sum, it is true, and it occasioned a few evasions of truth and white lies, all of which I think were very wrong indeed, in theory, and would rather not put them in practice. For we knew Miss Matty would be perplexed as to her duty if she were aware of any little reserve funding being made for her while the debts of the bank remained unpaid. Moreover, she had never been told of the way in which her friends were contributing to pay the rent. I should have liked to tell her this, but the mystery of the affair gave a piquancy to their deed of kindness which the ladies were unwilling to give up, and at first Martha had to shirk many a perplexed questions as to her ways and means of living in such a house. But by and by, Miss Matty's prudent uneasiness sank down into acquiescence with the existing arrangements. I left Miss Matty with a good heart. Her sales of tea during the first 2 days had surpassed my most sanguine expectations. The whole country round seemed to be all out of tea at once. The only alteration I could have desired in Miss Matty's way of doing business was that she should not have so plaintively entreated some of her customers not to buy green tea, running it down as a slow poison, sure to destroy the nerves and produce all manner of evil. Their pertinacity in taking it, in spite of all her warnings, distressed her so much that I really thought she would relinquish the sale of it, and so lose half her custom. And I was driven to my wits' end for instances of longevity entirely attributable to a persevering use of green tea. But the final argument, which settled the question, was a happy reference of mine to the train oil and tallow candles which the Esquimaux not only enjoy but digest. After that she acknowledged that one man's meat might be another man's poison, and contented herself thenceforth with an occasional remonstrance when she thought the purchaser was too young and innocent to be acquainted with the evil effects green tea produced on some constituents, and an habitual sigh when people old enough to choose more wisely would prefer it. I went over from Drumble once a quarter at least to settle the accounts and see after the necessary business letters. And, speaking of letters, I began to be very much ashamed of remembering my letter to the Aga Jenkins, and very glad I had never named my writing to anyone. I only hoped the letter was lost. No answer came. No sign was made. About a year after Miss Matty set up shop, I received one of Martha's hieroglyphics, begging me to come to Cranford very soon. I was afraid that Miss Matty was ill, and went off that very afternoon, and took Martha by surprise when she saw me on opening the door. We went into the kitchen as usual to have our confidential conference, and then Martha told me she was expecting her confinement very soon, in a week or two, and she did not think Miss Matty was aware of it, and she wanted me to break the news to her. For indeed, Miss, continued Martha, crying hysterically, I'm afraid she won't approve of it, and I am sure I don't know who is to take care of her as she should be taken care of when I am laid up. I comforted Martha by telling her I would remain till she was about again, and only wished she had told me her reason for this sudden summons, as then I would have brought the requisite stock of clothes. But Martha was so tearful and tender-spirited, and unlike her usual self, that I said as little as possible about myself, and endeavored rather to comfort Martha under all the probable and possible misfortunes which came crowding upon her imagination. I then stole out of the house door and made my appearance as if I were a customer in the shop, just to take Miss Matty by surprise and gain an idea of how she looked in her new situation. It was warm May weather, so only the little half door was closed, and Miss Matty sat behind the counter, knitting an elaborate pair of garters. Elaborate they seemed to me, but the difficult stitch was no weight upon her mind, for she was singing in a low voice to herself as her needles went rapidly in and out. I call it singing, but I dare say a musician would not use that word to the tuneless yet sweet humming of the low worn voice. I found out from the words, far more than from the attempt at the tune, that it was the old hundredth she was crooning to herself, but the quite continuous sound told of content, and gave me a pleasant feeling as I stood in the street just outside the door, quite in harmony with that soft May morning. I went in. At first she did not catch who it was, and stood up as if to serve me. But in another minute, watchful pussy had clutched her knitting, which was dropped in eager joy at seeing me. I found, after we had a little conversation, that it was as Martha said, and that Miss Matty had no idea of the approaching household event. So I thought I would let things take their course, secure that when I went to her with the baby in my arms, I should obtain the forgiveness for Martha, which she was needlessly frightening herself into believing that Miss Matty would withhold, under some notion that the new claimant would require attentions from its mother that it would be faithless treason to Miss Matty to render. But I was right. I think that must be a hereditary quality, for my father says he is scarcely ever wrong. One morning, within a week after I arrived, I went to call Miss Matty with a little bundle of flannel in my arms. She was very much awestruck when I showed her what it was, and asked for her spectacles off the dressing table, and looked at it curiously, with a sort of tender wonder at its small perfection of parts. She could not banish the thought of the surprise all day, but went about on tiptoe, and was very silent. But she stole up to see Martha, and they both cried with joy, and she got into a complimentary speech to Jem, and did not know how to get out of it again, and was only extricated from her dilemma by the sound of the shop bell, which was an equal relief to the shy, proud, honest Jem, who shook my hand so vigorously when I congratulated him that I think I feel the pain of it yet. I had a busy life while Martha was laid up. I attended on Miss Matty and prepared her meals. I cast up her accounts and examined into the state of her canisters and tumblers. I helped her, too, occasionally in the shop, and it gave me no small amusement and sometimes a little uneasiness to watch her ways there. If a little child came in to ask for an ounce of almond comfits, and for the large kind which Miss Matty sold weighed that much, she always added one more by way of make-weights, as she called it, although the scale was handsomely tuned before, and when I remonstrated against this, her reply was, "The little things like it so much." There was no use in telling her that the fifth comfit weighed 1/4 of an ounce, and made every sell into a loss to her pocket. So I remembered the green tea and winged my shaft with a feather out of her own plumage. I told her how unwholesome almond comfits were,